Welcome back everybody, and today we're going to be playing Paint Our First Space Marine. And for many months I've been scouring the internet, lapping up all the different videos there is on how to paint and manufacture and do everything else in the hobby, and I've come across quite a few that discuss the Grimdark method of painting. And one such site is Travarian Miniatures, which has a great how-to on how to paint using both a sponge and a brush to create blood angels. And I thought that looks pretty good. Why don't we start there and see if we can make a bit of a good fist of that as a first up effort. And now in terms of the paints, I don't have the Mephiston Red that was used. I've got the Army Painter set, and I'm going to try making the most of the Triad system that uses a base, a midtone and a highlight, and see if we can progressively use that to build up the color tones. And so first things first, we undercoated the little guy in just black. And as a sponge, I've just used a cosmetic sponge and cut that down to a reasonably small piece and used that to apply the paint to the model. Now the first paint that we actually used was part of the Triad, and it's the base called Traitor Red. And so we diluted this down in the palette sufficiently enough that we could dab it on almost like a wash, so that we're not putting on just solid paint. The idea is to have some degree of transparency so that we can build it up progressively, and we don't want to dab it everywhere. We're trying to stay away from the joints, I guess, the sort of all the low points in the armor that we want to stay dark. And so it's just a matter of progressively building that up over the rest of the model. Now the second color that we use is called Chaotic Red, and rather than going straight to that, I thought I would actually mix the base and the midtone together to get a transitional color and use that progressively to have a nice transition and see if we can sort of get away from obvious layering. And the idea obviously is to try and have a very smooth transition from one color to the next, going from our base to our highlights, so that it doesn't look like there's zones of color. And so we stuck with the sponge, and it is the quick way obviously to put the paint on, and it does create a degree of texture on the model. But I don't think that's a problem. I wasn't using it in the sort of the chipping method, which is a very small amount of paint on the sponge so that you're barely leaving anything on the model. This was more a case of applying a reasonable quantity, not having it dripping, but enough to color the model. And just the nature of touching the sponge onto the plastic seems to leave high points and low points, which can be used to create a degree of texture on the model. Once we'd done a pass using the combined base and midtone, we then did another coat just with the straight Chaotic Red midtone color to start to brighten everything up a little, keeping away from the edges again. And once we'd completed that, there were areas that looked like they needed attention that couldn't be reached properly with the sponge, so we ripped his arms off so we could get in underneath there. Fortunately in this instance, because this is a starter set, the arms are just stuck on pegs and I haven't actually glued them on yet, so it was just a matter of detailing. And in this way we were just using a brush, not doing a very sort of precise method, but really just stippling the paint on into the zones where we wanted to increase the brightness. And then what we thought we'd do is go for a chromatic black. So we grabbed the Cloudburst Blue Speed Paint, which is a wash sort of contrast paint, and put that onto the weapons. The idea is hopefully to get a very black looking color that's got a sort of a blue tinge to it rather than just being a solid black, and it might give it a little bit more sort of interest when looking at it. And so initially I just put it onto part of the chainsword, but in the end I ended up doing the whole thing. but just picking out all those areas on the model that are supposed to be, or I have chosen to paint black, like the vents on the backpack and straps and the sort of the joints in the armor with the corrugations, that sort of thing. So it was just a matter of applying a few coats of that, and then onto the highlight, which is Rebel Red, and again diluted it down and sort of mixed it partially with mid-tone color, still going for that sort of layering approach to try and have a nice progression or gradient from one color to the next. And it's just a matter of getting a sufficient amount on the brush there and dabbing it on. You can see I'm not actually applying it in little dots anywhere. I'm really just sort of trying to get a broad coverage to start with, and then refine things a little as we go along, with the darker base underneath and the fact that it's diluted. You've got a degree of sort of slop where you don't have to be so precise, which is rather fortunate given that the brush control is still in its infancy. Now the Aquila on his chest, we also decided to use the Cloudburst Blue speed paint on, just to darken it up as well, just to give it that grimy look, get rid of the red. So we coated that on and let that dry in. That's just there to darken everything up. And then also on other areas of the armor that are supposed to be black, so the detailing around the shoulders and other elements that we needed to do. The leather we left alone, and that was actually just detailed later on. But first things first, we just took several coats of that to do the necessary sort of highlighting, and then we just did a pinline wash where again we diluted the speed paint down sufficiently enough that we could dab it into the recesses and have it somewhat run in. Unfortunately, focus not so great, but ultimately the idea was to pick out all of those lines on the armor so that they look a bit dark, because we weren't able to preserve those while we were doing the red sponging, given that it's a sort of a all over approach and it's not so precise. So just went in and systematically picked out all of the grooves around the armor, on his face mask, around his feet, that sort of thing, anywhere where we could sort of emphasize the separation in the armor plating. And one coat was relatively good, but at times it looked like it needed a second, so we just had to go over that and duplicate to ensure that we had sufficient darkness to provide a reasonable contrast. And so at this point he's not looking too bad. So now's time to go in and actually just do some of the finer details to refine this. So let's jump in on the deep end and try starting with the eye lenses, because they're always easy. So we've chosen a couple of greens in the Triad system, but we're not worrying too much about the midpoint because I don't think I'm going to be layering that well. And we've just chosen the base green to do an initial color of the entire lens. And it took a couple of coats to just cover over the black/red color that was in there. And you can see a little bit's gone over the lower side of the eyelid, so to speak, but that's okay because it kind of looks like a little bit of a glow, and it's too awkward otherwise, especially with the brush I was using. And then the idea was to just put a little bit on the front part of the lens of the highlight color, which we managed to get in there. And then lucky last, which I don't show, is actually putting a specular highlight in the back corner, just a dot of white on both lenses. Now some other bits and pieces that are slathered all over the model. We've got a purity seal, so I painted that in a plain white and just did some squiggles with some black, and then used the Army Painter Pallid Bone speed paint to go over the top of that to tone it down, and then did a little bit of an edge highlight with white. And then it was on to all the leather pouches around his belt, and it was just a matter of using all the grey Triad to sort of introduce edge highlighting and scratching and sort of variations in the color. So very random sort of effort of just putting some dark colors on and then systematically building that up and trying to create a degree of distress on the leather. And likewise we decided to highlight sort of the feathers on the Aquila just on the outer edges to try and provide an increase in the contrast from the base sort of dark color that we had. So just the top of the skull, a little bit on the lower part of the face and the other wings. And then for the weapon, it was a case of, Travarian showed you sponging on some blue and then some grey and highlighting with some goblin skin or something like that, Nurgle skin I think it was. And so what I chose to do was actually get some of the mid-grey and mix it with the blue sort of speed paint just to provide a little bit of toning, and stippled that on to both sort of the stock and part of the weapon and also the entire blade of the chainsword, and then toned everything down using Agrak's Earthshade just to sort of give it a dirty sort of look. And it's about the only Citadel paint that I have, and so we just slathered that on just to grime everything up and try and blend everything. Now interestingly, because it is Speed Paint 1, we got a little bit of reactivation because I did use some of the blue speed paint in that stippling mix, and so it sort of created an interesting sort of camo pattern where some of the bits kind of looked like they lifted off, and that seemed to be okay as a totally random thing that occurred. Now, final thing to do is sort of do some distress on the armor plating, and I just chose to use a silver, in this case just the metallic plate mail silver, which is a darker color, just to do some edge highlighting around the shoulders, across most of the surface of the gun, and also highlight some of the moving parts and also rivets or screws, whatever they are, that constitute the assembly components for the weapons, and also on the sword to try and show some degree of distress to make it look like it's been used. And so it was just a matter of letting it dry out on the brush rather than wetting it, not putting much on the brush, and then just being very progressive and cautious with the application. Otherwise you tend to get very thick sections even if you use the side of the brush and it didn't look particularly flash. And lucky last was to dirty down the Aquila, and I thought, well, I'll try making it a sort of a dark browny color rather than going to a muddy wash that had been suggested. And so I put the speed paint all over it, and it had a rather uniform finish, which wasn't really acceptable. And so I went in afterwards and actually sort of highlighted the edges of the feathers again in silver just to provide some better contrast, and made up a nice little base with some rocks and some grass, and sort of toned it down to some earthy shades so that it was a reasonable sort of contrast to the red armor. And there we have one completed Space Marine, apparently of the Space Wolves group, Space Wolves, the Blood Angels, but didn't have any decals suitable to this particular group. So at some point I might go back and try applying those. But for my third model, I'm somewhat happy with all that. Might try a blue ultramarine next. But thanks again everyone for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.